You should never have more than 7 things on a screen at one time. That is the rule of 7, or the magic number 7, plus or minus 2. This is a rule that we've probably all heard of, but can it possibly be true? Answer: no. Let's look into Miller's law. So this is a really interesting kind of interaction and user experience design myth, that there's this kind of magic number 7, and it's the total number of things you can hold in your working memory at any given time. And to expand on that, we've also got 7 plus or minus 2 from the original research. And this just isn't true. It's probably the most misunderstood principle within the kind of user experience interaction design sphere. Now, Miller's law does kind of create the issue in itself, because he coined this phrase in this context, the magic number 7 plus or minus 2. But he never intended for it to be a hard and fast rule about how many things could be on a screen at any given time. Let's start by taking a look at the original research and paper that he published and go from there. Miller originally published his paper, The Magic Number 7 plus or minus 2, in 1956, in which he looked at sort of how many different things people could hold in their working memory at any given time. And that makes it sound like the rule of 7 is absolutely true. If that's what he found, then we should use that and we should apply it. But what he actually found was that we can hold around 7 plus or minus 2 chunks of information in our working memory at any given time, depending on a vast array of different things, including location, time of day, mood, approach to taking the information in, how the information was displayed, what kind of information it is, whether or not the different chunks of information were relevant to each other or entirely separate, and of course, prior familiarity with the topic. There's simply too much to be able to say, yes, it's 7, or it's 5, or it's 6. And even with the plus or minus 2, he accepted that you can't actually put an accurate number on this and have it apply to all people. So instead, what his research really highlights is the importance and the power of chunking information. And for those of you who have been instructional designers for a while, you will be very familiar with the concept of chunking. And this is what Miller's research focused on. How many chunks of information could the people hold in their working memory at any given time? And the really important difference here is that if this was just things, how many things could you be? We could be talking about letters, which means one word would take up multiple slots in your working memory, if we want to think of it like that. It's a flawed way of looking at it, but stick with me. In fact, what he found was there wasn't really a limit to how big a single chunk of information could be. So a chunk could be a letter, it could also be a word, it could also potentially be a sentence. It wasn't about how much information was in it, it was about how that information was chunked, how it was arranged, what meant that it fitted together. Effectively, it's kind of internal relevance within the chunk. And as long as it was relevant, the chunk could continue to grow. Now, later studies have kind of found limits on that, but Miller didn't necessarily come across those because that was not the original and primary focus of his research. So, the problem kind of arises from the title of his work, but if you actually read it, if you actually read his paper, it is a masterclass in the power of chunking information. So, let's take a quick look now at exactly what that looks like from a learning design perspective. So for those who haven't done this before or just don't know, chunking is the principle of breaking down a large amount of information into smaller chunks to make it easier to process in our working memory, and then obviously decide whether or not it needs long-term encoding or whether or not we can kind of pass it out as being unnecessary at the moment. And a really great example of that is phone numbers. Now, not many people these days actually even remember phone numbers anymore, in terms of keeping them in their brains. We can store them in our phones. But for those of us old enough to remember, when you had to remember telephone numbers, and they were probably landline telephone numbers, the most common thing to do was to chunk that information. Rather than remembering this really long single string, you would split it up. For most people, you would split a phone number up into 3, certainly in the UK and I think in the US as well. So for me, for instance, that would be the local code, the dialing code, and then the first 3 digits of the individual number and the second 3 digits. So it might be 01793 553 229. I don't know whose number that is. I'm terribly sorry if you get phone calls. Don't phone that number, guys. Let's not be silly. But you can see how just those quick separations give it a cadence, they give it a run on. One chunk links to the next, but they are separate. What it also means I can reuse bits of those chunks. So for instance, the dialing code, that's a dialing code for Swindon. So that chunk will start all the Swindon phone numbers. Brilliant. Now I'm saving space when I do get round to encoding that to longer term memory. So when we're looking at using this in a learning context, we really want to be considering, what are the things we want people to take away from, let's say, this page or this interaction or this video? What are those chunks? How are we separating information out and saying, here's a thing, hold on to it. Here's another thing, hold on to it. And are we doing too many or are we doing not enough? Finally, specific to things like e-learning and application design, how many things are you putting on the screen at once? They need to be able to take in your user interface, any buttons, controls, information into the working memory, process it and decide what to do. That really is where Miller's Law comes into its own. It's about considering how many things you have on the screen and whether or not they all need to be there. Whether or not you can reduce the number below 7 or 5 or 3. You don't want to have any erroneous or unnecessary information being pumped in to that working memory. That's where you get into the realm of kind of cognitive load discussions. But by keeping only what's necessary in the working memory, you're using Miller's Law in a sensible way that ensures people know what to do or can quickly make a decision on what to do without being kind of paralysed by choice. So, given that that's where the research is at, where has this concept of 7 come from and why is it so popular? Well, the simple fact is, Miller messed up. He called his paper the magic number 7 plus or minus 2, and that is what stuck. Not, of course, his carefully considered research, not his carefully worded conclusions, not his excitement about the concept of chunking and the impact it can have. No, the title stuck with people. It is the quintessential didn't read the article but I have an opinion kind of thing. So what we really need to do is stop focusing on you can only have 7 plus or minus 2 things on the screen at any one time, and instead be saying, is everything on the screen necessary? Is everything being said necessary? Is everything on the board necessary? And how do we chunk it? How do we break this down into logical, internally relevant chunks of information that are easier to hold in the working memory? So that's Miller's Law and how it applies to learning design. If you want to learn more, I'll include some links in the description of this video. I would love to hear in the comments how you're applying different laws of UX and if there's a video in this series you'd really like to see us do. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up and please do consider subscribing to the channel. It really helps me out. If you didn't enjoy this video, go back and watch it again at 75% playback speed. I promise you'll enjoy it much more.